Welcome to the Russia.Post podcast, hosted by Maria Lipman. In the Russia.Post podcast, we'll talk with experts, thinkers, and academics based in Russia or elsewhere about the developments in Russia proper, as well as about a range of Russia-related topics. Today, Maria speaks with Thomas de Waal, author, journalist, and now senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Tom explains Russia's role in the conflict, the domestic political implications for its combatants, and the prospects for a resolution. Thanks for listening.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining me today.
Good to hear you.
In your recent article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, you were writing about the way Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine is affecting the crisis, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This conflict currently has not been at the center of the world attention, mostly, of course, because of the war in Ukraine. Can you please start with saying a few words about the history of the conflict and what happened in the past years?
Sure. Well, very glad to be with you, Masha. So obviously, we're talking about the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is the oldest and still unresolved, the oldest kind of Soviet conflict, ethno-territorial conflict, dating back to 1988 in its modern form, and in its original form back to the early 20th century, when the end of the Russian Empire and the formation of the Soviet Union and the kind of ethno-territorial compromises that the Bolsheviks made in the Caucasus, and the foundation of the autonomous oblast, autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was founded in 1923, an island of autonomous Armenians inside Azerbaijan, an arrangement which suited neither side in Soviet times, but more or less worked, but then broke down pretty rapidly in the perestroika period, and in 1988 became a dispute of the Karabakh Armenians wanting to leave Soviet Azerbaijan and join Soviet Armenia, and becoming then this big rivalry between Armenia and Azerbaijan across the whole territory of those two republics, and then 1991 becoming a full-scale war between those two independent states. Then we have the first Karabakh War of the 90s, won by the Armenian side pretty decisively at huge cost to both sides, but especially to Azerbaijan, which lost a lot of territory and had more than 500,000 displaced people. The Armenians taking over Karabakh, a kind of semi-frozen, suspended state of a ceasefire, which then broke down again in 2020, more than a quarter of a century later, with an Azerbaijani offensive 44-day war in the fall of 2020, completely reversing the situation from Armenian dominance to Azerbaijani dominance, with the Azerbaijanis recapturing all the territory that they had lost in the 1990s, and including some of Armenian-populated Karabakh as well. And only with the last-minute introduction of a Russian peacekeeping force, which I guess had been the Russian agenda for a long time, were the Karabakh Armenians protected at the end of that conflict. So it's still unresolved, but we now have Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh. We have new negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, this time mediated by the European Union for the first time. And with the context of the war in Ukraine and Russia being distracted and weakened, I think this has given the kind of driving seat to the EU to be a mediator. And I would say, and as I say in my Foreign Affairs article, paradoxically, we're sort of closer to conflict, I think, than we were before, but also closer to a resolution. It's a much more dynamic situation now between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, we'll certainly get to what enabled Azerbaijan to be so much more successful lately in this conflict and to recapture the territory. But I would like you to speak a little bit more about the Russian peacekeepers, what their function is, how long they have been there, and whether their function and their operation has changed lately.
Right. Well, I guess the prehistory of this is that in 1994, Russia negotiated a ceasefire between the Karabakh Armenians in Yerevan on the one hand and Baku on the other. And the Russian intention was then to introduce peacekeepers, just as it had in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, as a kind of wedge to insert Russian influence over the conflict through a peacekeeping force. Now, that was actually rejected, interestingly, actually by both sides, more explicitly by Azerbaijan, but the Armenians, I think, also didn't want Russian peacekeepers at that point. So you had a kind of self-regulating ceasefire with no peacekeepers back in 1994. But a quarter of a century on, in 2020, with the prospect of a complete Azerbaijani victory, this was the price that Russia exacted from Azerbaijan for letting them keep their territorial gains, and also, from letting the war escalate, which was a real possibility, of inserting a peacekeeping force in Karabakh at the end of 2020. But it's quite a different peacekeeping force, it has to be said, from previous Russian ones in the Caucasus. For one thing, it's quite small. The nominated number of soldiers is 1,960, which isn't that great. I mean, there's obviously some auxiliary staff as well, which boosts the numbers. But I think the latest figures I've heard is it's down to about 1,600. So it's not a big force. And secondly, and I guess even more importantly, it's unlike other conflict zones, this is a peacekeeping force with an expiration date. It's there for 5 years and can be extended, but 6 months before that 5-year deadline is due, which is actually May 2025, either of the three signatories to the ceasefire agreement, November 2020, that's Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and we're talking really about Azerbaijan in this case, has a right to veto the extension of the peacekeeping force, which means that Baku has some leverage here over Moscow, over extending the peacekeeping force. Clearly, the Russians want to stay. We know that once they're in a conflict zone, they don't like to leave. There's the old joke about how the Russians like peacekeeping, as in keeping a peace, kusok in Russian rather than mir. And I'm sure the Russians will have strong arguments about why it should stay. But still, formally, Baku does have a veto, and Russia values its relations with Azerbaijan and will have to bargain in 2025. And of course, we don't know what the international context will be in 2025. And this is a big question, which maybe we could talk about a bit later. But, could this be replaced perhaps by an international peacekeeping force? I think what's pretty clear is that the state of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan is such that if there's no peacekeeping force left in 2025, there will be some kind of conflict.
Right. Of course, we'll get to this issue a bit later, but I would like you to say a few words now about the role of the EU, which is kind of maybe using the void because Russia is too preoccupied by the war in Ukraine, or maybe this is not an inadequate description. But I think you sounded slightly more hopeful when you mentioned the EU and its attempts to probably make a deal or approach to making a deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan. If I'm right, what makes you a little bit more hopeful?
Sure. Well, the first thing to say is that this is the sort of a moment of eclipse, maybe not complete death, but eclipse of the OSCE Minsk group, which was 30 years old last spring, and then the co-chair mechanism of the OSCE Minsk group, which since 1997 has been France, Russia, and the United States, 3 co-chairs which have been the mediators on this conflict. Azerbaijan has basically rejected that mechanism. And now with the war in Ukraine, Russia cannot really work cooperatively with France and the United States on this conflict. So that mechanism is basically now deactivated. And much to the dismay of the Armenians, because it was a mechanism that was designated to look at the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, but that's the reality. And so the EU has basically stepped in as a kind of replacement honest broker, if you like. I guess both sides know that they have to deal with Russia, but Russia has so many agendas in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in the Caucasus as a whole, that it's not regarded, I guess, as an honest broker by Baku and Yerevan. The EU has stepped in as a kind of obvious substitute, and quite successfully so far. Charles Michel is the President of the European Council, is now convened 3 meetings between the 2 leaders, Nikol Pashinyan and Ilham Aliyev. Toivo Klar, who's the EU special representative, is frequently in both capitals. And they're being, I think, deliberately downplaying expectations. They're saying we are a mediator, we're a facilitator, we're not going to own this process, we're doing what we can. And they're also, and this is really important, trying to facilitate as many bilateral contacts as they can between advisors, between ministers. They're saying, if you can sort this process out between you, all well and good, which is something that the Russians have not shown any interest in doing. Surprise, surprise. So far, so good. But it's an incredibly difficult conflict. Trust is zero. Azerbaijan is very confident. There are lots of security issues. And there's also this difficult issue about how to, manage two parallel processes, one from Moscow and the other from Brussels.
Sounds pretty complicated. Tom, can you please explain why and how has the balance of forces between Armenia and Azerbaijan changed over the years? And especially recently, of course, you said that you reminded that Armenia defeated Azerbaijan at early stages already many years ago, but now the situation looks exactly opposite. So how did this happen and why?
Sure. Well, this is obviously a story over many years. It's a story of Azerbaijan's oil and gas wealth, which it started acquiring in the mid-2000s when the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline opened, and then the South Caucasus gas pipeline, and then Azerbaijan spending literally billions on its military budget. It didn't really have an army when it was defeated in the 1990s, and they built an army. They acquired weaponry, and they got training, I think, crucially from Turkey. And I think this was a crucial factor in the 2020 war, that you had Armenian forces in defensive positions, which were still relying on kind of old-fashioned kind of 1990s tactics and, old Soviet tanks and so on, facing an Azerbaijani military which had been trained by, a very professional NATO standard military in Turkey, and also Turkey providing these military Bayraktar drones, which Ukraine has also been using quite effectively, basically destroying the Armenian defensive position. So suddenly, many people had assumed, and first of all, the Armenian military themselves, that they could defend the territorial gains they made in the 1990s. But they were suddenly swept away very quickly by this Azerbaijani offensive, which chose a very opportune moment for Azerbaijan, a moment when the world was distracted by a pandemic, when the United States, which might have been expected to intervene, was having an election campaign, and Donald Trump didn't care about this kind of region anyway. And when they had Turkish support from President Erdogan. And that's, I guess, the kind of nuts and bolts reason why Azerbaijan prevailed in that 2020 conflict. But I guess more generally, the kind of depressing thing about this conflict is it's a kind of story of hubris on both sides. It's a story in which both sides, with some exceptions back in maybe on the Armenian side in the 1990s, believe that force solves all questions, that diplomacy is secondary, that ethnic cleansing works. And unfortunately, this kind of logic, which the Armenian side, employed back in the 1990s, the Azerbaijani side is now employing in the 2020s. And those of us who watch this conflict, wonder, can this cycle ever be broken without another round of ethnic cleansing?
I see. Can you please also speak about the two presidents and the significance of this conflict and where it is now for them, for their respective constituencies and their elites?
Well, in Armenia nowadays, it's because of the change of constitution, it's not a president who's in charge, it's a prime minister, Nikol Pashinyan, this extraordinary kind of populist figure who swept to power in 2018 on the back of a peaceful revolution, a man, a politician of the streets, committed to democracy of a rather populist sort, but who badly miscalculated in 2020, who really didn't care about the Karabakh issue, in contrast to his two predecessors as Armenian leaders, who were both from Karabakh, who was really focused on his agenda in Armenia itself, and then sort of basically gave up on negotiations, didn't really give the Azerbaijanis much to work with, made some populist speeches, and basically sort of drew a line under the peace process, weak as it was, which gave the Azerbaijanis the opportunity to say, well, this isn't working and we have the right to use force now. So he then lost that war badly through many miscalculations. But to the surprise of many, I guess, actually got re-elected in 2021 despite having lost the war, largely because his predecessors were the main opposition and the Armenian public, I guess, regarded them as an even more unpalatable choice than Pashinyan. So Pashinyan now re-elected with a mandate despite the opposition of his predecessors, the opposition of the Karabakh Armenians, many in the diaspora, basically signaling that Armenia has to change its mind and change its thinking on this conflict. He's talked about lowering the bar on the status of Karabakh. He's talked about dealing with Azerbaijan. So quite a role of resistance to Nikol Pashinyan, who is, I would say, quite an iconoclast. He's also negotiating with Turkey, much to the dismay of many, particularly in the diaspora. So that's the individual we have on one side. And on the other, we have Ilham Aliyev, president of Azerbaijan since 2003. I must initially elected on a two-term presidency, but a bit like Mr. Putin, I've kind of almost lost count of which term he's on now, but certainly, indefinitely president of Azerbaijan, an authoritarian state. He more or less inherited the job of president from his father, but has impressively used that war and the mobilizing against the Armenians to build himself a new mandate in Azerbaijan. And I guess the question about Ilham Aliyev is, having won that victory, having whipped up this strong, aggressive anti-Armenian feeling in Azerbaijan, what does he do now? Does he keep using this as a kind of mobilizing, legitimizing force, this anti-Armenian sentiment, and keep on trying to kind of get more from the Armenians? In particular, does he want to try and get the whole of Karabakh back and expel the Armenians? Or is he prepared to deal? Is he prepared to kind of stop there, decide he's got 80% of what he wanted, he's got back all the occupied territories, and it's time to kind of do a deal with the Armenians and focus on shared projects, such as, in particular, opening all those closed road and rail transport routes which have been closed across the region for the last 30 years.
Tom, since you know the region so well, what do you think is more likely? You have now described what Aliyev may be likely to do. Do you think he's more likely to probably go all the way and gain even more territory and make his victory over Armenia even more decisive? Or do you think he'll be more pragmatic, as you mentioned, talking about transport ways?
I kind of have to hedge my bets here, Masha. I mean, in March, there was an escalation in Karabakh where the Azerbaijanis walked into this Armenian village. They were intimidating Armenian villagers by putting loudspeakers outside these villages, telling the Armenians to leave. There was a clear signal that they wanted to do more. And yet, since then, they've stepped back. There have been these rounds of negotiations in Brussels. The test will be, and Charles Michel, the EU Council President, has talked about this, the test will be whether we see a change in the public rhetoric from President Aliyev. He's basically keeps on giving the same tough anti-Armenian victory speech. Pashinyan has changed his tune. He gave a very remarkable speech, really, to the Armenian parliament on April the 13th, saying this has got to change. So far, we haven't seen a kind of response from Ilham Aliyev in public, and that's what we're looking for. But clearly, if he does want to keep on pressing, he's got to deal with the Russians, who are obviously weakened, but they're still there. And he's also got to consider that this means that the idea of building new road and rail links to Turkey and to Iran, which are only possible through Armenia, that he's not going to get that. So I guess there are arguments either way. It's the arguments of a kind of, first of all, domestic politics and this kind of mobilization point about keep on going and pressing the Armenians against the idea that actually for the moment, he's got pretty much all he can get. And the EU has given him an opportunity and is potentially offering him quite a lot of money, I guess, for these transport infrastructure projects to do something different. But I'm afraid the jury's still out about which way it's going.
I see. So let's get to Nikol Pashinyan again. So apparently Nagorno-Karabakh is such a crucial issue in Armenia to every Armenian, as far as I understand. You referred to Nikol Pashinyan as an iconoclast and as a person who talks to Turkey and who seems to be even, as far as I understand you correctly, yield some territory and actually scale down the claims, Armenia's claims. What is the public opinion? I mean, maybe anecdotally, and I know you go to the region, you talk to people there. What do public opinion polls say, and what are your personal impressions? What do people think about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be precise, what Nikol Pashinyan is saying is he's not exactly giving up on the Karabakh Armenians, but he's saying that the conversation needs to change to a conversation about their rights and guarantees, their security, rather than territorial claims. So I guess what he's gently doing is ruling out independence for Karabakh as the official policy in Yerevan. And it has to be said, Yerevan really doesn't have any opportunity anymore to kind of push that agenda because they lost the war, they lost the whole surrounding regions. They have no military presence in Karabakh. They've lost a lot of bargaining power. So I guess this is just a reflection of that post-war reality. What does the Armenian public think? Well, I think the Armenian public is quite traumatized by the war. And, it's a small country which lost 4,000 young men mostly in a matter of weeks, which was obviously very traumatic. But I guess the Armenian public also is quite weary of this conflict. And I think if any deal emerges which seems to guarantee the rights of the Karabakhis and seems to kind of guarantee also Armenia's own territorial integrity, which some people think is under threat, and sort of promises some way forward with transport routes opening, I think a lot of the public would back that. They certainly did vote for Nikol Pashinyan last year, knowing that he was probably moving in that direction. I think the problem that Pashinyan has is that a lot of the political establishment is against him. The defense ministry probably is against him. Even quite a lot of the foreign ministry is a bit skeptical. I think he governs with quite a small circle. So I guess the question is, if there are no obvious results soon, more people, I guess, are going to start questioning why he's doing this, saying, why did you ever start talking to Azerbaijan? They never deliver, etc., etc. So if there's no progress in the next month or two, then he could start having some problems.
I see. So this is an extremely difficult conflict and probably one of the most irreconcilable that we currently see in the world. And I would like you to now get back to what you promised to talk about in the beginning, the issue of the international peacekeepers, maybe the prospect of probably some kind of deal, whether it is reachable, to what extent Russia may be cooperative, something that is not what Russia has been on any issue in recent years, and especially very recently. So how do you see the situation play out? I understand that, of course, the final answer is you don't know, but all these issues, the expiring mandate of the Russian peacekeepers, the possibility that Azerbaijan can veto any kind of deal if it wants to, it has the power, Russia's role, undermining or maybe cooperative. What can you say about that?
Well, I guess first thing to say is that we all have, those of us watching and those of us on the ground, have a date, end of 2025, which really focuses the mind, because if there's no deal on the security of Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenians there, then things could deteriorate quite rapidly. And, this conflict is all about security, really. It started largely because the Karabakh Armenians were worried that they would be swallowed up by Azerbaijan, that they would lose their homeland back in Soviet times. And then Azerbaijan also felt its security was threatened by all these kind of armed Armenians on its territory, threatening its own integrity. So there was this kind of mutual insecurity at the basis of the conflict. And so that is the first question that needs to be resolved. It's the question that needs to be resolved before any kind of political status issue is resolved. It's the security issue. And as you've alluded to, we have a Russia problem here. Russia, has its own agenda here, which it's now got its own nice military base inside what is internationally recognized Azerbaijani territory. That's useful for many reasons, but it's also a prestige issue for Russia. So you've got the kind of competing interests of Azerbaijan, which ideally doesn't want the Russians there, but knows that it will have to bargain on that, but also knows doesn't want a conflict. So in some kind of peacekeeping force is also a kind of useful buffer for them. You've got the Russian interest, which is to stay. You've got the interest of the Karabakh Armenians who want some international security guarantees. And then you have to ask yourself whether there's any kind of international organization, be it UN, be it US, OSCE, which would take on this role and would commit, peacekeepers to this rather distant conflict zones. It's quite a headache. And I think the good news is because of that deadline, that should be focusing minds in places like Brussels, but also, I guess, in Moscow about what to do next.
I see. Well, at least you used the phrase good news, so at least something to maybe hope for. And as far as I understand, you'll continue traveling to that region, and I hope we'll talk again about this currently irreconcilable conflict. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.